Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 8. Today, we're going to be talking about bringing unhealthy behaviors into healthy relationships. Not that you should do that, but how easy it can be, especially if you were raised in a toxic household. When you're raised in a narcissistic family, you are exposed to a lot of unhealthy behavior. And there are even times when you're called upon or expected to mimic that same behavior. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is arguments. Arguments were prevalent in my household growing up. Screaming and yelling. It was very emotionally volatile, very performative. And I remember I was often put in the role of mediator. I would be expected to mediate arguments between my parents or defend my narcissistic parent. And if there were times when I didn't want to argue, if I didn't want to yell, or if I didn't defend my narcissistic parent well enough, I would get shamed and guilt-tripped like you would not believe. My narcissistic parent would tell me things like, you're my only friend. You're the only person that I've got in this house. And if you don't defend me, then I don't know what I'm going to do. And, it's not fair that they treat me like this. And if you're not here with me, then I might as well not even be here. Everything from guilt tripping and shaming to threats of self-harm. And so as a kid, you're thinking, okay, I have to be here for my narcissistic parent, because you don't realize that they're narcissists or that this is unhealthy, controlling, toxic behavior. They're just mom or dad, and you love them and you want them to feel like you care about them. And so you kind of start to think to yourself like, okay, this is my responsibility. Like, I want them to know that I'm here for them and I want them to be happy. So if I have to do these things and kind of defend them in an argument so that they don't hurt themselves or so, they're not upset with me, then that's what I'm going to do. Maybe they're alone and I'm their only friend. And that's what friends do. They support each other, right? And the more often you do this, you kind of pick up on a lot of the behaviors that your narcissistic parent is displaying. And so I feel like I learned how to argue both through observation and participation, right? You're witnessing your parents arguing with each other and you're starting to realize, because as a kid, I feel like you learned so much through behavior that if you're witnessing this so often, you start to think, okay, if I'm faced with any kind of a stressful situation or controversy, like this is the way to handle it. This is what I do because this is what my parents do, right? And I trust them and I look to them as an example. Or, I was also taught, I guess, how to argue through participation, where again, I was expected and called upon to engage directly in very adult arguments surrounding topics that were far too mature for a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old. These personal marital issues, these financial hardships or problems, these were things that I didn't cause, I couldn't change, I couldn't fix. These were kind of well beyond my capability as a child. And yet I was directly involved in a lot of these things. And there were times where I didn't necessarily agree with what my narcissistic parent was saying. But again, you kind of have these things in the back of your head now where you're the only one who's there for them and they rely on you. And, so you kind of feel pressured to defend them and to take their own opinions on as your own and to help further their argument. And when you witness things like gaslighting, or, twisting reality to kind of better suit someone's narrative. All of these really toxic traits that a narcissist might employ during an argument to win, right? And to break down whoever it is on the other side. You start to pick up on those things and you start to display them yourself, especially during these arguments. And so you might be a kid having no idea what gaslighting is, and yet you are directly engaging in that because that's the behavior that you have grown accustomed to. That's what you've witnessed. That's what you're expected to do. And the more you do that and the better you do that, that's when you get that positive reinforcement from your narcissistic parent. You get that praise and love and validation. And so it starts to kind of make sense in your head where, okay, when I do these things, that's when things are good for me. That's when my parent feels happy and supported by me, right? So this is the right thing for me to do. And so unknowingly, you might be participating in some really toxic behavior, and that can be so dangerous. And I think this is furthered by the whole idea of narcissistic families and emotionally unskilled families in general falling under that category of a closed family system, where outside perspectives are not welcomed and you're encouraged, sometimes really even pressured, to not talk about the things that go on within your own house, especially the negative things, like what happens in this house stays in this house. We don't tell anyone about this. And I think for me, it was kind of amplified because when I was younger, in this time in my life, I didn't have a lot of close friends who were peers of mine. And so I didn't really, go over anyone's house. I didn't witness what other family dynamics were like. I didn't see how they handled controversy or what the overall mood of the house was more often than not. And so when you are introduced to these behaviors over and over and over again, and they really just become a part of your day-to-day life, it's so easy for them to just start to feel normal. They're integrated into your day-to-day, and so you stop thinking about them. I remember I thought for the longest time that the way my family functioned was the way that everyone's family functioned. That, if someone said or did something that upset their parent, there was going to be a massive blow up, right? There was going to be some huge emotional reaction with screaming and yelling and stomping and cutting people off and covering your ears. So volatile and extreme. And I just remember thinking, because I hadn't been exposed to anything else, and these things were recurring, they were happening so often, that it only made sense to me as a kid that, okay, this must be normal. This must be the way that everybody does this, right? And so when these things are happening so often and you're exposed to them from such a young age, these really developmental kind of formative years of your life, where for a lot of the time, you're relying on your parents to kind of guide you in the right direction, to teach you the way to do things. You're learning through behavior. So the things that you're witnessing, maybe you're kind of taking on and implementing in your own life. And especially if you're called on to directly engage in something like an argument, and the better that you are at screaming and yelling and getting in someone's face and intimidating people and gaslighting someone, all unknowingly, without engaging in all of this with, I guess, any kind of a negative intention. You're going into this and doing these things because you want your narcissistic parent to feel loved and supported by you. And because you know that when you do these things, you're going to receive that love in return. And that's all that kids want is love and affection for their parents. And clearly they'll do anything to receive it. So when you witness this for such an extended period of time, and you're actually called upon to put these things into practice time and time again, it can be so easy to not realize what you're doing and to subsequently carry some really unhealthy behaviors into healthy relationships in your life. And this is something that I talk about pretty often. I didn't realize a lot of my own trauma until I met my husband, until I was in my first romantic relationship. And I think that happened for a couple of reasons. First, Brandon was the first person in my life that I had met who I really, truly cared about and saw a future with. Up until Brandon, anyone that I had met was not worth the wrath that I knew I would face when I would come home and tell my parents, I'm dating someone or I have a boyfriend. And I knew that when that day came and I told my parents, that it was going to be a huge source of tension. And so Brandon was the first person who I was like, this relationship is too important to me to just roll over and let this go. I really care about this person and I see a future with them. And so I have to stand my ground here because it's worth it. He is worth it. And so that was exactly what I did. I stood my ground, and sure enough, everything in my life got much worse. And it made me realize that, okay, maybe things haven't always been all that normal, because the more that I was kind of standing my own ground and becoming my own person and standing up for something that I believed in and putting myself first, this was something that I wanted, that my narcissistic parent didn't want for me, right? They were not happy with the idea of me dating someone, of me having a boyfriend. They viewed him as a threat, as someone who would be taking me away from them. I would be spending my time with him. I would be less available to them, and I would start becoming my own person, right? Because now I have this outside perspective and I'm doing things that I want to do instead of always doing what they wanted me to do. And so I think they just felt this loss of control and they didn't know how to handle it. And so their unhealthy and toxic behavior was really intensified. And it made me realize, after it was all kind of ramped up now, okay, like this doesn't feel good. Like this is not okay. Even now, I'm still living there and I still don't know what gaslighting is or what narcissism is or anything like that. But I remember starting to think like, okay, getting yelled at like for hours every single day, like consecutively for weeks at a time, like this doesn't feel good. This isn't okay. Or being lied to about certain things, whatever it might be, something, a light bulb kind of went off in my head. I was starting to see some red flags. And so I started to realize, like, if this isn't good now, maybe it wasn't good then either. And I started to kind of think about everything, and it started to make a little bit more sense to me that these behaviors had always been there. But I was always so quick to just kind of roll over and do whatever my parents wanted so that life was easier for me, to make them happy, to appease them, so that they would think well of me. I wanted them to be proud of me as their kid, and so I wanted to make the right decisions by them. And I didn't realize for a long time that the only way that I could ever do that was by making the decision that they wanted me to make. And so now here I am, the first time doing something that I want, that they don't want. And all of a sudden, it's like I'm a different kid. Like I'm a bad kid. Like I hadn't done everything that I had done for them for the last 21 years of my life. And so that, I think, was the first kind of eye-opening thing to me, where I started to realize, okay, maybe this was a little bit worse than I even knew. And second, I think I started to realize a lot of this stuff after I met Brandon, because, the nature of your relationship with a romantic partner is so intimate and it's so close. You get to know each other on such a deep level. And, Brandon and I were living together, we were working together, and our relationship, I guess we had the deepest bond that I had had with anyone in my life outside of my family up until that point. Even with friends, you see each other on certain occasions and, there's that dynamic there, but you're not building a life together necessarily. And so I think the nature of our relationship and the fact that we were living together and all of that, we were going to encounter some arguments or some disagreements, some challenging situations or even stressful situations. And so I started to see that I was mimicking behavior that I had grown up around in my own relationship, because that was all I knew. And I thought that that was the way that you handled controversy and disagreements. I was just doing what I knew and what I was taught. And the first thing that I guess kind of comes to mind is the idea of direct communication. And that was something that was not present in my household growing up. Everything was very convoluted, very secretive. If you wanted to do something that, your narcissistic parent didn't want you to, it's like, well, how can I either lie about this or present it in a way where it's more favorable to them? Nothing was ever just open and honest and direct. It was always very convoluted. And, I remember if Brandon would say or do something that would upset me, I wouldn't directly address what that was and tell him, oh, hey, like this thing that you said or did, like it hurt my feelings. It didn't make me feel too good. So can we talk about it, or can you not do that again in the future? Absolutely not. He would say or do this thing and I would just feel sad and get quiet and distant. And maybe if I was upset and I felt like he was in the wrong, maybe even a little passive aggressive. And I felt like it was his responsibility to pick up on what he did wrong and the way that I was feeling, and then for him to go out of his way to try and make me feel better, to see what the issue was. And, when that didn't happen, I didn't know what to do. And so again, it was all very convoluted. And I was only doing this because that was all that I had been exposed to up until that point. But I started to realize, this doesn't feel very good, And this translated to other aspects of my relationship also. I, for the longest time, was convinced that Brandon was talking negatively about me behind my back, or if we were hanging out with a friend and I left the room for a minute, that they were talking about me, or they were saying something that they didn't want me to hear. And, if I came back in the room, they were going to change up the conversation so that I didn't know. And it took me a while to realize that wasn't happening. But the reason that I felt like it was, or at least that it could have been, was because I grew up in a household where triangulation was so common. I mean, parents talking about parents, kids talking about kids, parents talking about kids, two kids. I mean, everyone, it felt like, was talking about everyone. And so there was no real safe space there. You felt like anything that you said or did, first of all, was going to be watched and analyzed and talked about. If it was negative, it might be held against you. And I remember times when I was younger engaging in conversations with my narcissistic parent about my other parent, really negative topics, saying things that a spouse should never say about their partner, especially not to their kid. And, if that other parent walked in, just switching up the conversation like that so that they didn't know what we were talking about. And looking back, I hate the fact that I participated in that. But I remind myself that I didn't know any better. And again, by doing this and engaging in these kinds of conversations at that time, at that age, I'm just thinking, I'm here for my narcissistic parent, they know that I'm on their side and I want to support them and make them happy and make them feel like they're not alone. And it's so, when you say these things out loud, it's so manipulative. When you think about it, I could never imagine, if I have a kid one day, using their innocence and I guess just the fact that they're kids who don't have the tools yet to kind of diagnose behavior as healthy or unhealthy, and using that lack of knowledge and that innocence for my own personal gain, and manipulating that to kind of further whatever my agenda was. It's wild to kind of talk about and to have experienced and to say these things out loud. But I would engage in these things also. And so if these things were happening when I was younger with my parents and I was involved, and this is a family, this is a loving, caring relationship, then why wouldn't this be happening in my current relationship? And it took me a while to realize that, that's not normal. Not everyone does this. It's not the right thing to do. This also affected my interpretation, I guess, of love and care, control and dependence. Growing up, I was so controlled and sheltered by my parents. And it wasn't until I was in my own relationship and I would say to my husband, I'm going out with a friend of mine. And he would respond with, oh, that's great. Have fun. And it took me realizing that feeling so disappointed and upset, like that response meant that he didn't love me, he didn't care about me, was a result of what I had grown used to when I was growing up. I was expecting an interrogation. Maybe he would invite himself along. I wanted him to express to me in some way, shape, or form, even if he, and this is the weird thing, even if he let me go, right? He can't let me go. I'm my own person. But even if I ended up going and he was okay with it, I wanted him to at least express that he didn't want me to go, right? That he'd rather me just stay at home with him because he's going to miss me. And it took me a really long time to kind of associate someone in my life that I wanted love and care from, fostering any kind of independence or encouraging individuality within myself. It took me a long time to kind of view that in a positive light, because for such a long time, I equated love with control because of my relationship with my parents. And I guess the last way that some of these more negative behaviors kind of made their way into my current relationship was hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is something that I talk about a lot. When you grow up with a narcissistic parent, you are exposed and oftentimes rewarded for being aware of every change in the mood or tone or energy of your narcissistic parent. And the better you get at predicting what they want, what they need from you, how they're going to react to something, whether you should or shouldn't bring something up at this time, what should I say, what shouldn't I say, the better off life is for you. And so this becomes a pattern of behavior that is really, really difficult to shake. And I remember when I was younger, sometimes even feeling like I was the parent, like I was the more emotionally mature person in this relationship with my parent at 11, 12, 13 years old. And it was kind of bizarre to me, but at the same time, I remember feeling like, okay, well, I can handle this. Like I can handle whatever it is that's going on. I have to worry about my parent, right? Because they are the emotionally reactive. They are the emotionally volatile. And I want to avoid a blow up at all costs, right? Or if there is some kind of blow up, then I'll be there to diffuse the situation and try to make it all better. And this is so exhausting. It's such an exhausting cycle because at the end of the day, you can't regulate someone else's emotions for them. But when you're a kid, you don't even know that you're actively doing this, and you're going to continue to try because you want your parent to be happy. And so it's kind of just a constant cycle of trying to guess what they need, trying to prevent anything negative from happening, diffusing the negative situation when it does happen, and then, just managing it from there. There's never any kind of resolution where, okay, this happened once and it's not going to happen again. You're always trying to make sure, you're always, I guess, on edge, trying to make sure that your narcissistic parents' emotions are regulated. And what happens when you do this so often, I've realized, is that you don't allow yourself any space when you're younger to regulate your own emotions or how to learn how to regulate your own emotions. You kind of just suppress whatever it is that you're feeling because it's almost like, okay, I know I'm fine. I can deal with this, and I really can't be bothered with this right now because I have them to worry about. And so you don't really learn how to regulate your own emotions. You don't learn how to express the way that you're feeling. And so you suppress a lot of these feelings, and they're going to come out at one point or another. And, for me, I remember feeling like I never, ever wanted to put out into the world, into my household, anything negative. Nothing negative or pessimistic or upset, because there was often enough tension and stress where I didn't want to add to that. You know what I mean? And what good would it do me to express this negative emotion when all it's going to lead to is controversy or an argument? I'm going to be blamed for something. Maybe we had an argument the other day and I'm still feeling kind of upset about it because I never got an apology. But me expressing that I'm still upset about it is just going to make me the target, right? I'm going to be blamed for not moving on and for living in the past and for, being upset about something that I shouldn't be upset about. So not only are you not taught how to do a lot of these things that you should be taught and getting practice at when you're much younger, but it's also really easy to kind of apply that same hypervigilance later in life as you move into adulthood. It's not uncommon for it to follow you into other relationships in your life. And that was the case for me. I still find myself, I feel like I am hypervigilant. I don't know if I will ever not be, but I just don't act on my impulses the same way that I used to. That's kind of where I'm at. But I remember early in mine and my husband's relationship, I'd be paying attention to everything that he was doing, kind of like ready for whatever, his every want, his every need, anything. Okay, do you need your coffee heated up? I'll go do it. Got it. No worries. And you wouldn't even have to say anything. Maybe you just sipped it and looked at it kind of sad. And I'm assuming oh, you know what? It's been like a half an hour. It's probably cold. It's relax, right? But I remember feeling upset with my partner when he didn't do those things in return, because I didn't know for a time that they were abnormal or unhealthy. So if I go to get the laundry and I come into the room and I start folding the laundry and he just sits there and continues to do whatever it is that he's doing, there were times when I would be upset by that. Because one, I'd be okay, why are you not paying attention to what I'm doing all the time, right? No matter what you're doing, I know can't you be paying attention to two things at once? And also what I'm doing is probably a little bit more important, right? Then I come into the room and I start folding the laundry, and it's why are you not noticing that I'm folding the laundry and that I probably want help with that, even though I didn't directly communicate that to you, right? Because I'm not going to ask for help. I have a hard time asking for help because sometimes that would even cause waves. So it's why are you not just assuming that I want you to help me with the laundry and then stopping what you're doing and coming over there and folding the laundry with me? And it was kind of hard because I realized after a time that I was the problem there. Hypervigilance is not a healthy behavior. It's not normal necessarily. And so not only did I have to recognize that behavior within myself, I also had to not allow myself to resent my partner for not displaying those same unhealthy behaviors back towards me, even though I thought that him displaying those behaviors meant that he loved and he cared about me. So it was a whole process to kind of unlearn all of this, all the while not feeling any sort of upsetment or resentment that, I'm so hypervigilant and you're not. That's not fair. Why don't you do that for me? And just realizing, if my partner was doing that for me, then that would be a problem because that's an unhealthy behavior. And by not doing those things, he's actually displaying a lot of healthy habits. And so I guess it's been a bit of a multi-step process for me in terms of not continuing or allowing unhealthy behavior that I had grown really accustomed to throughout my childhood to impact healthy relationships in my life. And the first step for me is recognition. And it's very similar to developing a level of self-awareness when you start to realize your trauma or you're starting on your healing journey. You have to recognize that you are displaying these behaviors and that these behaviors are toxic or unhealthy or negative. And I guess a little bit of an offshoot of this, especially for the golden child in a narcissistic family, they are more susceptible to picking up narcissistic tendencies than other children in that family. And so moving into your adulthood, I know I displayed some narcissistic tendencies early in my relationship where, I expected the hypervigilance to be turned around on me, where the person that I loved and cared about and was receiving love from, they should be hypervigilant towards me. And so I was kind of expecting, why are you not paying attention to me all the time? Why are you not freaking out that I'm upset and doing anything and everything to try to make me feel better? And I didn't know what narcissism was. I felt justified in that because that was all I was taught. And so I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing and that it was right of me to expect this from another person. And it can be a really hard thing to admit when you're wrong and to kind of come to terms with the fact that maybe I was the issue here. Maybe I was the one causing all of this and displaying these negative behaviors. It was me. And I think what makes this especially hard after growing up in a narcissistic family is you are not in that environment rewarded for accountability or taking responsibility for your actions or admitting when you made a mistake. And so I guess bringing to the surface and being okay with recognizing I did something wrong. You know what I mean? And maybe it was hurtful and maybe I was angry and I made the wrong decision. Recognizing that and being able to communicate that to a partner is so difficult because you feel it's not something that you're accustomed to, and it's scary in a lot of ways, but it's so necessary to be honest with yourself, because if you don't understand what you're doing, how you're acting, and you can't kind of see these things now as negative, that's where the true issue comes in. And something that was really beneficial for me in terms of recognizing these behaviors as negative was perspective. And there was this chunk of time in my life where I worked for this home staging company, and I was the youngest one who worked there. It was a small team, probably of only maybe 6 to 8 ladies. And I was the youngest one there by probably 20 years. Everyone else besides me was a mom. And I never really thought anything of it because we all got along really well and our dynamic was great. And this was all happening when Brandon and I first met, like the very early stages of our relationship, probably the first few months. And I didn't realize until much later how important it was for me to be at that job at that time in my life. When Brandon and I first met, he was entertaining the idea of maybe moving to the West Coast for a little while. And the more we got to know each other and the more and more we started to fall in love, I remember thinking to myself, like, I might entertain this idea also, like if he goes, I might go with him. I was saving up to move out at that point also. And I was kind of, I was 21. I had never lived anywhere else. I didn't go away to school. So I had this itch to kind of go out on my own for the first time. And what a perfect opportunity. And now I was petrified of even bringing this up to my parents because I knew that it would trigger World War III. I mean, they had a hard enough time with the idea of me dating. And the thought of me maybe moving across the country, I didn't even want to think about what that would do. So I was talking to a couple of the moms at work about it. And I was like, yeah, but I'm probably not going to be able to go or not be able to do it. And they were like, oh my gosh, like you have to do it. Or even if you don't move out there, like at least take the trip with him out there. Or, if you move out there and you don't like it, like what's the worst that can happen? Just come back. And now that to me was mind blowing. I was like, you're encouraging me to like go out on my own and move across the country with this boy that I met and fell in love with and like do all of this stuff that I want to do that's like really, probably not okay. And it was so eye-opening for me because these weren't just peers of mine. You know what I mean? Like girls in their 20s who were like, yeah, go for it. Like, fuck what they think. Like, this is your life. Like, go. Like, these were moms. They were in the same position as my parents. They have kids. They have jobs. They're responsible adults. And they were encouraging me to do this, to make this decision, or to at least take the trip out there and telling me that, the only thing that they regret is not doing more when they were younger. Like, I wish I had taken that trip, or I wish I had done that thing, and you're so young, like you should go do it. And this was a completely different narrative to me than anything I had been exposed to in my own life with my own parents at home. I mean, it was hard enough to go to the movies or, out to hula hands. And now to have these adults kind of reassuring me that like, this is completely something that you can do if you want to. It was so eye-opening. And so I remember going home and I eventually brought it up to my parents and we talked about it. And the next day I came into work and one of the moms was like, how'd it go? And I just shook my head because sure enough, World War III, that kind of began a string of just daily arguments for weeks or even months after that. And so I just kind of shook my head like, it didn't go well. And she was like, oh, like, was there yelling? And I was like, was there yelling? Like, yeah. Like, do you not yell at your kids? Like, do you guys not yell in your house? Especially like if you're talking about some kind of like a sensitive subject. And it's like, it kind of clicked for me, I guess, in that moment that, okay, wait a minute, not everyone's family exists the way that my family exists. And there are households and parent-child relationships where I could go to a parent and say, hey, so, I'm really in love with this boy and we've been dating for a while and I'm thinking of moving out there with him. And, what is your suggestion? How can we maybe make this happen? Can we talk about it? And we can have a healthy, civil, understanding conversation. Like, that's a possibility that exists in this world. And that was just like, talk about a realization. And so I guess perspective in general, witnessing other parent-child relationships or, talking to other adults about issues that really weren't issues at all. They were just conversation topics or something going on in my life that were huge issues with my own parents. It started to give me a little bit of perspective where I was like, okay, maybe what they're doing isn't all that right because this is a lot better. I like having these like normal, calm, normal volume conversations instead of like getting yelled at and being told that I can't do something at 21 years old. So perspective was really beneficial for me in recognizing a lot of these behaviors. And also, I guess there were a series of realizations, and there still are sometimes directly prompted by something like this conversation with the moms at work, where it kind of like a light bulb went off in my head and I was like, oh, okay, like maybe this isn't too healthy. And other times they were completely random, like waking up in the morning or just sitting in having a conversation with my husband and realizing like, oh my God, like I have trust issues. It reminds me of like a character in a video game that you just have the silhouette of until you get to a certain level and then you unlock the character and you can like see them. And it makes me think, especially when you've dealt with any kind of trauma when you were growing up, that you don't always have access to everything at all times, and you can't necessarily control when these things become available to you. Maybe they're always there, but you just don't have access to them until you're ready to handle those emotions and to kind of deal with whatever situation this might bring up. You're just not ready yet. And so once you have the tools and maybe the emotional maturity, or you're in a safe enough environment to kind of process all of these things, maybe now these things start to become accessible and you have the tools to handle them, right? You're maybe more emotionally skilled than you once were. You're in a supportive environment, and now you can actually start to heal from these things. And so I remember a number of times just being in the car, driving somewhere and being like, oh my God, like I want you to control me because I think that if you love me, then you have to control me too. And these things just click. And I guess after recognizing that you're displaying these behaviors and that they are in fact negative, which takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong, especially coming from a place where admitting you're wrong is awful. It's awful. I guess the next step is a willingness to change. And this was something that I had a really hard time with my parents and our relationship. I remember thinking, if we would have a big disagreement, or even after I moved out, if I present them with this information, right? Maybe a very clear like cause and effect. This happened and this is how I feel because of it. Like it makes so much sense. It is clear and concise and on a silver platter that there would be no way that they wouldn't understand it, right? But it took me a long time to realize that you can't reason with unreasonable people. And people only change when they want to. You can't change people. They can only change themselves if they want to and when they're ready. And I think what helped me to kind of develop this willingness to change was being on the receiving end of healthy behavior for some of the first times in my life. And it makes me think about the first time that I ever apologized to Brandon after we had an argument. And, My go-to for a long time in light of any kind of controversy was like, I instinctually just got defensive, right? And I'm going to prove my point and stick to it. I will not show any weakness. You know what I mean? Because this has to be like, my feet are set in stone right now. I cannot admit that I did anything wrong or that I misspoke, because then everything that I say will be invalid and it'll be held against me for God knows how long. And so, over time, I was starting to recognize like, okay, maybe this isn't the right thing to do. Maybe not everybody reacts this way. And so Brandon and I got into a little bit of an argument. I don't even remember what it was about because the actual subject of it is so not important. I think how we handled it that's the thing that really stuck with me. So we got into an argument, and after a little while, I guess I cooled down a bit, and I realized like there was no denying that I was in the wrong. Whatever I said or did or the way that I acted was wrong. It was my fault. And I felt compelled to apologize because I knew that I was wrong, and I love him and I care about him, and I couldn't elude the blame. It doesn't feel good. And so I remember walking into the laundry room and just saying like, I'm sorry, like I was wrong and I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry. And, it was so like, it felt so uncomfortable because like this was uncharted territory for me. You know what I mean? Like this was not a good thing in the house that I grew up in. Not only like, should you not admit your mistakes, but you also never received an apology, especially from your narcissistic parents. So like apologies, reconciliation, like moving on, that was just not a part of my experience growing up. And so I apologized, and he was like, it's okay. Thank you. I was like, what? Like, that's it? Okay. That's okay. Thank you. And now we're going to move on. You're not still mad at me. Sorry actually means something. And you're not going to like hold on to this and then hold it over my head and bring it back up like later on today or tomorrow or a week from now. Like, this is it. We're done. And that was it. And so being on the receiving end of healthy behavior like that really encouraged me to change my own behavior and to kind of let go and unlearn all of that really toxic stuff that I had picked up throughout my childhood, because I wanted to be that for him, for the person that I love and care about, for my partner. I want to be patient and understanding and move on from our controversy. I don't want to tell you that sorry means nothing and now everything is ruined and hold this over your head and remind you of it all the time. I don't want to be that. Because now, right, I have been shown and I've experienced behavior that was a lot more appealing to me than what I had been used to. Like this feels a whole lot better than getting yelled at and being shamed for this. And I didn't want to be that for my partner. And so being on the receiving end of that really helped me to develop and stick to this change, this willingness to change. I was so determined to better myself, and in turn for my partner, because he deserves that. He deserves an understanding partner who's emotionally mature and who displays healthy behavior. It's as simple as that. But the difficult part about changing all of this, right? Not to mention that chances are you're realizing these things and you're changing these things in your adult life. So you've already got a handful of responsibilities that you didn't have when you should have learned all of these things, right? Like when you were a kid, how to apologize, how to say you're sorry, how to admit your mistakes, how to be honest, all of these things, and even to regulate your own emotions. You should be learning these things when you're 3, 5, 10, 15, whatever it might be. And so, you're learning these things, chances are, in adulthood, after you've broken out of your narcissistic family, and you've got a ton of other responsibilities on your plate. But what makes it especially difficult, in my opinion, for children of narcissistic parents is you're not moving into adulthood and just kind of tweaking your behavior, or, maybe I'm going to change my opinion about this. Maybe I learned something and I feel a little bit differently now, so I'm going to make these little adjustments. You're not fine tuning. You are quite literally starting from zero. And not only are you starting from zero, to get to zero, you have to disassemble everything that has been built for you up until that point. Because chances are it's unhealthy. And maybe if it's not, you still have to at least question the fact that maybe it might be. So you have to disassemble everything to get down to nothing. And then you have to start from square one, brick by brick, building it back up to whatever kind of life you want to have, whatever kind of person you want to be. And while that's a really wonderful and beautiful thing, it can be so freeing, the feeling that you can redefine everything about yourself and your life to kind of better suit the future that you want. It can also feel incredibly overwhelming because this was all that you knew. These were all the tools that you've been given. And now you kind of have to figure out how to do all of this a lot later in life. And so that can be really difficult. It can also be really emotional because once you start to recognize this behavior, you start to trace it back and you can kind of find the root, like where did this come from? And that can bring to the surface some really sad memories or experiences. And now in this new headspace, right, you're more aware. Maybe you're starting to realize that you endured a lot of abuse that you were completely naive to. And so that can be really sad. And I think for me, the scariest part of this step in the process is numbness. And like I said, this was the scariest thing for me. This was probably the darkest point. I remember, recognizing these behaviors as negative and not making the decision where it's like, okay, this is something that I'm going to work on because I don't want to do this anymore. And then I'm encountered with a similar situation where typically I would react like this, right? I would react the way that I always had. But now I'm self-aware enough and I'm disciplined enough to say, okay, no, I'm not going to do that. But even though, I say that, these things still feel really true to me, kind of like inherently, like it's like my instinct, my knee-jerk reaction. This is the way that I feel. This is the way that I felt for 21 years. But I'm not going to let myself do it. But I also don't really feel genuinely these healthy behaviors yet. Like I can tell myself these things, but I don't believe them. I don't feel them. And so I'm not going to let myself feel these negative behaviors, but I don't feel the healthy ones either. And so I don't feel anything towards the situation. I'm numb. And that was the scariest thing to me because for a time, I just felt like I was broken. Like I was so fucked up that I couldn't be in touch with my emotions anymore. That so much bad had happened to me that there was nothing left there. There was no room for positivity. I felt like I would never get there. And I didn't realize that this was just part of the process, right? That for so much of my life, I had been exposed to and engaging in really toxic behaviors that it was going to take some time for me to unlearn those and for me to actually feel something on the other end of the spectrum. And the more distance that I got from that time period in my life, the easier these things would become. And the only way that I was going to get there was through practice, right? And that first step for me was just recognizing these behaviors and then dealing with that numbness, where it's like feeling nothing, I guess, is better than feeling bad and feeling the wrong thing. And eventually, you're kind of sitting in the middle in this weird limbo stage. And then you're like, okay, I'm going to do this now. I'm going to do this healthy thing. And like, I did it and I feel good. You know what I mean? Like I feel okay. And then something happens again and you do it again. And now it's like, I like the way that this feels. This feels truer to me. This is the kind of person that I want to be. And so the more practice that you get at that and the more distance you get from that toxic time in your life, the easier these things are going to be to integrate into your natural reactions, right? The more natural they're going to come to you. And that is such a wonderful thing and a really great feeling to kind of come out the other side of that, especially after dealing with that numbness, which can be so dark and confusing. And I guess the last step in this process, for me anyway, has been forgiveness. Forgiving past versions of myself for saying or doing things that, looking back, I know are unhealthy or toxic or hurtful. And I have to remind myself that so many of these things that I said or did, this belief system that I carried, I did it all out of necessity. I was surviving. And that's what we do as human beings. We try and figure out the best ways to survive in whatever environment that we're put in. We adapt to our situation. And unfortunately, for children of narcissistic parents, a lot of times surviving means embodying a lot of negative behaviors and kind of taking them on as your own and witnessing a lot of toxicity that you might subconsciously start to implement into your own life because this is all that you're exposed to. And so there are things, specific incidences that I look back on even still, and I'm not proud of the way that I acted or the things that I said. I should have been the person to stand up and say, this is not okay. This is not right, and I will not stand for this. I'm not going to treat someone like this. But instead, maybe going along with it, and again, I just have to recognize that I was doing all of these things out of self-preservation. I was in survival mode, and it can be really hard to reconcile, your past actions or words, especially if there were other people involved and maybe it was hurtful or upsetting, whatever it might be. But it's so important that you forgive yourself, that you remember the situation that you were in and the reasons that you did these things. And I think so long as you recognize these behaviors now as negative, you've developed this level of self-awareness that maybe you didn't always have, and you're willing to change, to let go of all of this toxicity and these unhealthy behaviors, and in turn, to become a much healthier person mentally, to become the best version of yourself for yourself, and in turn, for everyone around you. You absolutely deserve that forgiveness. You have to forgive yourself for your past actions, especially if you grew up in an unsafe environment. You were doing what you needed to do to survive, and all that matters now is what you do in a safe space. Now you can start to take steps to create the life that you want, to end the cycle and to not perpetuate this really negative, toxic behavior that you had grown up around. Even if you did display these things at one point or another, let them go and move on, and be patient with yourself while you're doing it, because it's a lot to unpack and it can be entirely overwhelming at times. But little by little, if you work at it every day, practice and distance from that time in your life, you'll get there. And with that, that's about all the time that I've got for this week's episode of It's Not Normal. I do have some of your comments that I'm going to be getting into over on Patreon. So if you're interested in that, hit the link that's down in the description below. And I just want to thank everybody who's been watching my videos and engaging. Anything from a like to a subscribe, even here on YouTube, goes a really long way. So thank you to everyone who's been supporting me, and I will be back very soon with another episode of It's Not Normal.